and the practical had a lot to learn from each other. And I was always interested in how could I be like a human Rosetta Stone for helping these big ideas make make it out into the world and have more impact.
Well, let's talk about some of your experiences. One of your earliest working experiences we were talking about earlier was a perfumer's apprentice.
Yes.
A lifelong passion. What about your work with Weight Watchers?
Yeah.
How did that develop your ideas?
So, well, it really was in many ways foundational to so much of the work that I do now. That was a thing that I did because 20 something years ago, I was overweight. I was 50 pounds heavier than I am now. Found success with that particular program and wanted to pay that forward. And I was doing that essentially moonlighting while I was a brand and messaging strategist in nonprofits, for profits, and agencies. And while on the one hand, I had this professional experience, working in brand and message strategy that said, this is how we're supposed to put messages together. This is how we're supposed to create change in a marketplace. And then I had this day-to-day experience in the meeting room for Weight Watchers, where again, the goal was to create change, was to help people think and act differently in order to achieve a goal. And yet all the things that I was told were supposed to work from a market level just didn't work at an individual level. So I was deeply fascinated by that. Like, what is it about information that people need to hear and understand before they'll internalize it, before they'll understand it, before they'll act on it? And fundamentally, I think one of the things that I took away from that experience is that nothing will work at the market level if it doesn't work at the individual level first. So that really set me on a path of understanding how is it that people need to hear information in order for it to be the impetus for change.
Have organizations got better at doing this?
No.
Well, I suppose
nope, they haven't. Nope, they haven't.
That's good and bad, I suppose.
Yeah, it is.
It's obviously bad, but obviously it creates an opportunity to help them.
That's right.
What's stopping them? Because in the past, you could say communication was much harder historically.
Yeah, I think.
But now there's a myriad of channels.
That's part of it. But I think that ultimately, it's when we think about communication channels, ultimately, I think it's what I refer to as a pipe and water problem, meaning that we're so worried about what pipe that we're sending information through that we're kind of ignoring whether or not there's sludge in the pipes to begin with. And I think the challenge that companies have when it comes to communicating their ideas, their value propositions, all of these things, is very similar to what I think the evolution, perhaps even the revolution that happened in economics, which by the way, I just soundly hated while I was in college and grad school. And yet somehow almost escaped with a minor in that. But meaning that there was this shift, particularly with the work of Tversky and Kahneman, from understanding that economics based on the rational thinker didn't always work out, that actually wasn't how people behaved. And I think that when it comes to marketing and brand communications, we're still in many ways suffering from that belief that people are rational and that the decisions are driven by rational, logical based arguments to begin with. And so that's where we base a lot of it. It's like, you have a problem, we have a solution, therefore you should have our solution. But it just simply isn't how people work. We're not rational decision makers. We're rationalizing decision makers. And so, my work is a small attempt to start to shift that perspective to say, well, how can we structure messages that work for that rationalizing piece first? Because that's actually what needs to happen. It's that story that we tell ourselves about a decision that is the first and most important story. So let's start there.
I mean, you help people tell their stories effectively. When did you first get inspired by storytelling? When did it first connect with you in your life? And when did you see it as a practical tool?
So I saw it as a practical tool really when I started working with the speakers at TEDx Cambridge here in Boston, Massachusetts. And mostly, I think, so it's part of my fascination with storytelling was that I didn't feel like I was very good at it. And I knew people around me who were very good at it. And TED Talks are famously, story driven in a lot of cases. And yet I found that a lot of the information that was out there about story to be unhelpful, or at least not applicable to the situations that I often found myself in, which was helping typically quite technical people, engineers, technologists, scientists, academics, explain their work. And so I needed to find something that, while I simultaneously understood the power of story, something that would actually be more practical for folks who didn't consider themselves to be natural storytellers to follow, first of all. And second, some kind of format that would be more appropriate for the kinds of ideas and the kinds of communications those people were talking about, which often weren't heroes' journeys. They weren't how like one person figured out how to solve everything. More often than not, these are ideas, and a lot of times I think particularly B2B companies have this as well, where these ideas are the product and the solution to very complicated sociological and societal influences. It doesn't come down to, one person and their character motivation. It comes down to, how does a group of people respond to things that are out there. So I just, like a lot of things, it was a thing I didn't understand. So I wanted to find out more about it and just went super deep on figuring out what would make it make more sense to the people that I was working with, and ultimately, how could I make more sense to people in general? And the red thread is the result of that.
Thank you, everyone, for who's joined us. We've got people from Poland, Switzerland, India, Denmark, United States, and elsewhere. Please send in your questions along the way. So in some ways, what you're saying, Tamsin, is that stories have been kind of hijacked by heroes.
They have been. That's a
They're seen
lovely
as
way to put it. Yes.
they're seeing as the people in them are heroic, doing fantastic things. But the reality for most people is that they're neither heroes or doing fantastic things.
Correct. Life is much more Game of Thrones than it is, I don't know, Superman, right? Like it's much more that way. And particularly again, with a lot of the companies that I work with tend to be impact startups, or companies that serve a much broader mission than just let's sell a thing. These are really kind of sociological stories that need to be told, and a lot of the tools that are out there don't tell those kinds of stories. And it's not that the hero stories aren't important, and not that they don't help shed light on things, but when we are trying to effect big change in the world and we have big stories to tell, we need to make sure that the tools that we're relying on to do that are as strong and as powerful as possible.
So, at what point do you need a story if you're a startup?
Well, I think, the way that I like to think about it is that every idea has a story because every idea is a story. And so the big concept, the big idea for me behind my book, The Red Thread, is that the best way to make ideas irresistible is to build the story people will tell themselves about it. And the way to start that is to understand the story that you told yourself. So the thing is that when a lot of times when we think about story, we think about those stories that we tell other people. And I think we do that at the exclusion of the stories that we tell ourselves. And yet story is how we make sense of the world. It happens pre-consciously. Gerald Zaltman of Harvard Business School says that 95% of our thinking is pre-conscious. And there's been just a whole ton of research on how this, Kendall Haven's work and some of the others, Uri Hassan's work, just about how fundamental story structure is to how we make sense of the world. So those stories, those rationalizations, those explanations, those justifications about why something works the way that it does, I think are critical for us to open the window and really examine those, because those stories operate like our own personal operating systems, both individually and organizationally. They explain why we do what we do the way that we do it. So when we talk about when does a startup need a story, I think a startup needs to understand the story that is behind their fundamental idea before they can truly have any hope of getting the most powerful version of that story out to prospective clients, customers, investors, partners, etc. So that's usually where I start when I'm working with people. It's like, okay, well, why is this the right idea? And typically, our instinct is to then answer that question with like features and benefits, with you know why is it important to us? But that perspective is of people who've already been convinced that the idea is right. But the people that you're talking to aren't there yet. They start as skeptics. So we have to build that story that makes sense to them, about why you do what you do and the way that you do it.
It's a good question coming from Peter Osborne, who's read your book and is now an evangelist, he tells me, for the book. How do you help companies create their red thread when everyone across business areas wants to have their input and final editing rights? I suppose the thing about stories is we associate them with a single person producing them.
So, and that's not how I have found to be helpful. So, in my career, I spent the first half of it, really, first 15 years of it, in organizations. And then I've spent the last, the 10 years since then, working in agencies and on the other side. So I've kind of seen it from both sides. When you hire somebody to come in and help you build your story, and then I've been the person you hire to come in and build the story. And the one thing that I see happen that doesn't work is exactly what Peter describes, where one person or one organization is charged with coming up with that story and then delivering it. And I think a lot of businesses have had that experience. They pay, this is a technical term, a metric crap ton of money to some kind of organization who builds out this beautiful tagline or whatever, and then people don't use it. Why not? Well, because it doesn't come from them. And so, the way I look at it is, if you want a story or a message to be part of an organization or even your everyday thinking and language, it needs to include your everyday thinking and language. So for me, Peter, this is the answer to your question, that it needs to be a co-created process, right? It needs to be a process where the key stakeholders in that outward facing message, and that can be your salespeople, your marketing folks, but the highest level folks that are charged with that kind of translation of the company strategy to the market and vice versa. This is a process that should happen with that group together. Not only because all of those stakeholders need to have that buy-in to that message, but the message is going to be a reflection of it. Remember what I said, where this, the red thread is really this operating system of an organization. There's a reason why a company does what it does, is says what it says, or has they have the customers that they do. And I think you need those multiple perspectives in order to come up with a message and a story that is not only accurate, but it is internalized enough by that organization to be both consistent and yet customizable to what they put out into the marketplace more publicly. I hope that answered your question, Peter. If not, let me know.
Yeah, no, I think that was a good answer. And Anastasia asked a very long question. Anastasia's from Greece, a nation of storytellers, in my experience. I think the key point: does the direction of a brand's storytelling strategy shift and change according to the emerging social norms or timing of events? Does an organization's story change as the world changes around it?
So I think that this kind of core essence of what makes a company do what they do does change, but not quickly. And so, if to explain this further, I'll repeat a quote that I cite in my book, which is from Agatha Christie, speaking through Hercule Poirot in one of her books, where she says that words are only the outer clothing of ideas. And so, if we think of this red thread, this kind of core operating system, this core story of an organization as the idea, then the words, the messages that we use to talk about that idea do shift depending on who you're talking to, what those societal norms are, what's happening in the universe at the moment. And I think the last couple of years are a great example of that, right? So we had companies who are doing what they're doing, like they have their line of business. And then suddenly the pandemic came, and then there was this choice: do we shift what we're doing fundamentally to meet the needs of people in this new business, Or do we start talking about what we're doing differently so that people understand how we can still be of service and of use during this time? And there's not necessarily a right answer there. I mean, I'm much more of a fan of talking about what you do differently, because that way you're operating from a position of strength. You're not trying to build new core competencies in the midst of change. But I think that fundamentally, like I said, to me, there is an operating system of a business and an organization, and that is that stays fairly solid. So, one way to think about this is, Simon Sinek obviously talks about, find your why, and he's talking about it in the why behind your what. Like, why do you do what you do? Um, and for me, the red thread is the why behind your how. Why do you do that thing that particular way? And the concepts and the kind of pressures, both external and internal, and the values and the beliefs and what's happening in the world, like those things produce that why behind your how. And that those things just don't shift very much, like over time. And but it really is just the language that shifts. And I think that's a key thing, that we need to make sure that we're staying tuned into what makes what we do relevant to other people, while holding steady with what makes what we do strong and worthy of kind of long-term support from the business.
I mean, you've alluded to this. How has the pandemic changed things and changed perspectives? And because it's been a great, it's kind of a catalyst or crucible, I think is the right word, for corporate communications, really.
It has, and I think in some unexpected ways. Oh my gosh, this there's so many ways to go with this. I mean, I think one of the things that we've seen is a little bit of what we were just talking about, where I saw a lot of companies try to, I refer to it as going to COVID town. They tried to move to COVID town, right? Like, instead of staying where they were and staying in their kind of home base of operations and competencies, they kind of moved to COVID town and said, well, we're doing this now. Which, for me as a lifetime brand strategist at this point, like, that hurts my heart, because you're trying to build everything new. I mean, think about when you move to a new place. You don't have connections established. People don't know who you are. You have to figure out everything new again. And I think that when you kind of make a quick decision to really shift fundamentally what your company or what you're doing, based on even if even if midterm as it turned out to be, but even, like, of a current event, you run the risk of putting yourself and your organization in a position that's much less strong than if you stay where you are and what you're doing. So that's one thing. The other thing that really comes to mind with the what the pandemic did, was when we think about communications and we think about messaging. Um, it's hard to look at the last 2 years, and I think we see this around the world, really, not see this sharpening of sides, of polarization, of pulling apart, and people having a very firm and strong perspectives on, what's right and what's wrong. And I think that what that's exposed for me, as we're looking at all this and thinking about all this, is um not only this kind of uh, insufficiency of hero driven messaging, right? And how that doesn't quite capture the complexity of the world as it is. But it also, I think, raises the importance of an area of research that I'm really interested in right now, on what some folks are referring to as primals, kind of these primal values and assumptions about the world that really drive what we do. For instance, there's people who just at their fundamental core believe that the world is a beautiful place, and that we're all connected. And then there are people who believe at their core that that's a dog eat dog world out there, and the world is hierarchical by nature. And I think that what we've seen in the pandemic is we've pulled the covers off of some of those kind of silent assumptions, and they've started to surface. And I think that, I'm fascinated by that because, my work is really all about having an organization or an individual state those silent assumptions. So the more that we can figure out what those are, both for ourselves and for other people, I think the better we're able to make those connections. Because again, back to my, the core function of my work is to the story you tell yourself, whether you do or not, but you're less familiar with the story that somebody else would be likely to tell about you. And I think that's the work that we can do as a result of the pandemic. And I think it's become more urgent as a result.
I should have commented earlier about the quote from Agatha Christie: "Words are the outer clothing of ideas." It's a beautiful idea, isn't it?
Isn't it? I'd love that. Yeah.
It's fantastic. I suppose you could say words are the outer clothing, and there's often nothing inside, though.
That can be the case. Yep. Yes, that absolutely can be the case. And that's part of what drove my work was to find a way to connect what a company wished were true about itself to what is true about itself. And to have that shift. I mean, I remember, I spent some of my early career working at a performing arts college here in Boston, Massachusetts. And, when I first got there, they talked about this interdisciplinary education because we had three divisions. We had a music division, a dance division, and musical theater division. And I don't know about you, but you hear something about interdisciplinary and you really feel like these curricula must be integrated with each other. And when I got there, and I was like, no, they weren't. They just kind of are all co-located. And so, when I first got there, the first thing that I shifted was, well, can we call it multidisciplinary rather than because it's interdisciplinary is not accurate yet. And the deal that I made with I was lucky enough to be on the executive team there, was that we can start using interdisciplinary when we change the curricula, when we actually start to change things so that it reflects that nature. Because it is what they wanted, right? So they were talking about what they wanted to be before they were that. But when it comes to, serving your customers, in this case, our students, that gap can be fatal, right? It can be fatal for brand perceptions. It can be fatal for those kinds of things. And it's when brands struggle, typically it's because there is too big of a gap between what they say they are and how they act. So to use another British quote, the kind of World War II, I think, no, it was World War One, kind of the deeds, not words. I think that's one of the things that, as much as I do my work with words, for me, it's about capturing the words that explain why the deeds of the brand, or why the deeds of the organization are what they are.
It always strikes me, you talked about performance, that for leaders in organization, telling the story and articulating is a performance, isn't it? And that's where you kind of encounter issues about authenticity and being inauthentic. Because often I think CEOs of organizations have to tell the story day in, day out, even if they believe it or not.
Yes. And
there's a strong
right.
performative, and the kind of political is very similar to politicians in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's difficult to do long term. It is. And that's, I think, where you see a lot of faulting, where a lot of those faults get exposed in what companies do. And so that's, again, one of the things that I was like, well, why do we ask people to do that? Why can't we, there's power in the story of an organization as it is, or else that organization wouldn't be where it is right now. It wouldn't be doing what it's doing. And I've found over and over again that it's not only more powerful, but more sustainable to find that story that's already strong and have people talk from that perspective. Because, the word, a lot of people talk about authenticity. And I think a lot of times, for me, the higher value, the higher bar to achieve is congruency or consonance, right? Where there's an alignment between what you say and what you do as an organization. And there isn't that gap between what you say your brand is and what people experience it to be. But I think the reason why that gap exists is because we don't have typically a way to understand why we do what we do the way that we do it, because it goes back to those silent assumptions. It's just, we see the world the way that we do. And because of things like the false consensus effect, we think that other people see the world the exact same way, but they don't. And so the more that we can articulate how it is that, what question we solve, why, how we approach that, like fundamentally is based on one perspective that's different than what other people say, that more that we can surface those silent assumptions, those values, those beliefs, those points of view that drive the work that we do, the more that we are exposing in a good way to our potential audiences and clients and customers the things that are actually what people connect to. Because we it's kind of the classic, even if two companies produce the same thing fundamentally, right? We're generally going to be aligned more with one than the other because of how they arrived at that thing, about why they produce it that way. And the easier answer for us might be, well, I like the way that one looks better or whatever. But there's a whole ethos behind that piece. And for me, that's what we're trying to that's what I'm trying to help companies articulate and give them a path for doing that, is how can you articulate the ethos, like how can you articulate that worldview, that point of view that drives everything you do. And that isn't just your mission and vision, because those are really internal documents. And a lot of times they're aspirational as well. What I'm talking about is something that articulates the day in and the day out, the thing that bridges between, the lofty brand position that you may have out there and the conversations that your salespeople have to have every day, or the conversation that your founder has to have, or that your CEO has to have when they're on investor calls. We've got to figure out how to bridge that gap, right, in order to make it easier for companies to find the right people and for the right people to find them. And for us to, just, even if we can start to solve the problem of the very short-term nature of most CEOs and CMOs in particular, the better. And I really think that comes down to having a deeper understanding of what gives rise to the brand. Not what it is, but what is it that is driving, again, back to that operating system analogy. What is the operating system that guides what a company's doing, that gives rise to the brand that people have in their heads?
It always strikes me that people who are good at this are salespeople, and yet their voice in organizations is often not as loud as it should be.
I am a passionate advocate for having sales people, or the person who's in charge of sales, be at the table when you're figuring out these core messages, because the salespeople, your frontline folks, maybe it's your customer service folks, they know what flies and what doesn't on the ground, right? They know what flies on the ground, and it's kind of the difference between in any situation, you need both the micro understanding and the macro. You need the aggregate and the ground truth, and your salespeople and your frontline folks give you the ground truth of what's happening. And so I think that if you are in charge of your strategy, your market facing strategy, whether that's communications or not, you've got to have both perspectives in play, or else you're going to likely miss something critically important, or it's just not going to work. It's just not going to fly on the ground.
But I suppose salespeople have the advantage in that they have a very clear audience,
Yep.
their customers and potential customers, and they have very clear feedback on whether a story kind of flies with that audience. Whereas I think higher up, the CEO, it's often very different audiences they're speaking to all the time. So getting the story right is more nuanced, I suspect.
It can be. I mean, I think that for very natural reasons, we often make it a lot more complicated than it needs to be. And so, I think of it as, companies are nuanced, and our world is nuanced. And it's part of the reason why I think that oversimplified kind of hero-driven story is not enough for us. We need something that helps us tell, Game of Thrones level stories, not just Superman stories. As great as Superman is, there's no dig on Superman. But I think, yeah, I think that's it. It really does come down to that kind of shift of, well, where I was going with that is that what we need, and the way to think about a strong message is, we need a, your audiences need a strong, simple container, right? We need the strongest, they need a bucket. And we need to craft that bucket for them. And a strong message should be a very, you know, simple to understand, easy to grasp, faith inducing. Like, you need to look at that message, that bucket, and go, I trust that. I think that's going to hold. And on the inside of the organization, you need to select, and we need to do the work to find a message that contains all the nuance and the sophistication and the complexity of that idea. The problem is that we tend to hand people all the insides of the bucket without a bucket. We try to say, like, well, here's all the nuance and like, we're handing them basically handfuls of sand, right? And we're saying, don't you understand? And they can't, because they don't have a way to put it all together. And so for me, that's how I really look at, like, that's the work that I try to do with a company, is like, let's find a bucket that we can use. And, the standard I set for myself is, I want to make sure that it is strong enough and large enough to contain all your complexity, but simple enough that your audience can grasp it, understand it, and be interested to explore what's inside.
Frank Karlberg from Switzerland's got I think there's a related question. When you reflect on the story of your own life, what answer did you find to the question, why do you do what you do?
Oh, so
And
Frank, I should introduce you to my therapist. No.
Well, you've just explained you're a seller of buckets.
I'm a seller of buckets. Yes, I'm an English to English translator, a seller of buckets, a human Rosetta Stone. I mean, I think that I'd like to think, maybe it's just me projecting onto the world, that a lot of us, I'm driven to help create knowledge. Like, that's a really important thing. Like, I want to make things easier for other people to do. And generally, I think other people who've done that want to do it because they have struggled with some tricky problem themselves. And so, yeah, I could go like way deep into my past and say, I often found that I wasn't able to articulate the complexity, the full power of an idea to people. I often felt like I was stuck in between two worlds. And so if I look at why I do what I do, it's because I I believe that the how we see the world drives what we do in it. And the more that we want to be able to do big things, the greater the importance on understanding how it is we're seeing the world in order to do that. And that has value. Like, I one of the lessons you asked earlier about Weight Watchers, one of the lessons that I took forward from Weight Watchers, I summarize in the statement that the greatest leaps start from the surest ground. Um, and I think that answers a lot, and that it not only answers hopefully Frank's question, but actually answers a lot for my philosophy about this, is that when you're trying to create change, either with yourself or within somebody else, and help somebody else create that it is easier and more likely to be successful if you start with the aspects that are already strong. It kind of goes back to what I was talking about when we try to move to COVID town. Like, when you move to COVID town, you're trying to build all new competencies and skills and connections, et cetera. But when you can understand what you already do that is different, unique, powerful, the skill sets that you've already built up, the competencies that you've already built up, you have an extraordinary treasure chest of things to draw from. And so a huge amount of what drives the work that I do is just to get people to understand the value of that chest that they're already sitting on.
Here's a comment from Rick Span in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. In music terms, congruence between the notes on the page and the tones we produce in the gig can be helpful to open up conversations on the gap between the stories we tell and the stories we live. I think there's something interesting there, Rick. I suppose you've got to live the story. It's no good telling a story and then not living it.
You are living a story anyway. That's my whole point. Like,
Yeah.
you are living a story anyway. Tell that story. And whether you think about it from an individual or a brand perspective, you are already living a story. Tell that one, because that way you have greatest control over it. You don't have to sustain some kind of gap between, those other things. And, yeah, back to the music terms. And one of the examples that I love to give of, like, to illustrate congruence from a physics standpoint, is that if, there's this coolest thing that happens, that if you have two tuning forks that are tuned to the same note, and if you strike one of them and then stop it, if they're tuned to the right note, that note will transfer to the other tuning fork, and you'll hear that other tuning fork sing that note, even though you never touched it. And to me, that is like the best illustration of what our work, if you're in messaging or in marketing communications, is to transfer with as little interference, as little loss as possible, but as also with as little effort as possible to get your message from you to them. And in order to do that, it is a product of tuning. So thank you, Rick, for introducing and reminding me of that interpretation of it.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I got a new iPhone last week, and it's interesting. It doesn't come with any instructions at all now. It used to have minimal instructions. And you switch it on. It says hello to you in 28 languages or whatever it is, and
Yep.
then it says, "Have you got an iPad?" And you say yes, and it says, "Show me your iPad,"
Yep.
and that's it done.
And then it's
And
all
you
set.
sort
I
of
know. It's
everything
just
else.
so intuitive. Yes. Yes. I mean,
So
it's that, and that's, and the reason why you already had an iPad. So this is the whole thing. It's just like there is an alignment, there is a congruence between how they think and how you think. And because of that, eh, and they've done that work in a lot of cases to understand what's natural for the people they serve. And there's plenty of people in this world that are not Apple people, right? And so those are different people. And I've always been really interested in, like, how that's okay, that your brand are actually not for everyone. And as much as we may say that, what we mean when we say that is everyone who thinks like we do, everyone who sees the world that we do, or everyone who could see the world that we do, the way that we do. But that's not everyone. And I think that having that kind of clarity is a real key for understanding how to shape not just brand communications, but the company strategy itself. And I think that's a real key to me that I've seen over and over again in organizations. It's part of why I like to work with startups, because I feel like I get them before they've gone too far too far down a path. We can still kind of shape it from the strategy standpoint at the beginning.
it strikes me in our conversation, Tamsin, that the word brand is kind of redundant in what we're talking about, because it's not brand communication or brand strategy. It's more important than that. You
Oh
kind of
yes,
you're actually giving people an excuse to marginalize it and say, oh yeah, that's to do with marketing. Actually, it's core to the organization.
right. So to me, when I think about, whether you call it the red thread or not, but this idea of the operating system, like I call it the red thread, but to me, the red thread is what gives rise to the brand. The story that a company tells itself, often pre-consciously, every day, in and out, all the people who work there, about why they do what they do the way that they do it, is what gives rise to every interaction, every product, every service, every communication that's out there. And so it's we spend so much time focusing on how a brand looks, right? To me, that's like looking and trying to make a web page work just by trying to, like, interact with what's on it. But the web page looks the way that it does because of the code that sits behind it. And so if you don't know the code, and if you don't know how to read that code, and if you don't know how to change that code, then whatever you put out to the world will never be what you really want it to be. And so that's really what I'm trying to get out there into the world, is to say, you have to understand your code, because you can say your brand is whatever you want it to be. You can try to make it whatever it is. But if the code doesn't support that brand, if that red thread doesn't support that brand, you will never make it. And I don't want that. like you've got a strong code. Can we operate and see what's the best thing that we can produce with the code that you have?
Christina Wells says, what tools or platforms should we consider incorporating to tell our story? And I suppose that's a common question, because there's a profusion of ways of telling stories and getting them out there these days. And actually, there's a threat of going down the wrong route.
Yeah.
Let's all communicate via WhatsApp or whatever, or social
I
media
don't
of one
know.
sort.
I mean, so one of the reasons why I do the work that I do now is because I really, in all my work as a CMO, I didn't like the conversations about channels at all. And because back to that pipe and water analogy I used right at the beginning, I just kept saying over and over again, like yes, the channels matter, but what is easier to control long term is whether or not you've got strong, clean water running through those channels, whatever they might be. So that said, I'm not going to leave you without an answer to that question, Christina. And I think the simplest one, and this comes back to we talked about ahead of time that my husband's a market researcher, but so it's definitely informed by him. Even though my undergrad work is in market research, you need to use the tools that your customers are using. I mean, I think you need to be where your people are, which means you need to know who your people are, and they're not everyone. So I think that there's, I see it. Given the work that I do, a lot of times I'm speaking at marketing conferences and social media conferences and content marketing conferences and things like that. And I see that kind of fear, like, now we need to be on TikTok. Like, do we need to be here? Do we need to be there? What do we need to be doing? And really, the answer just comes down to, is your audience there? And if your audience isn't there, it's like the only next best thing is the audience that you want there. Let that guide you. Uh, and generally, like that's about as detailed as I can get, because the channels change all the time. But what people need to hear about your organization or about your products and services to make a decision to invest, investigate, to choose, to whatever, to add you to their consideration set, that doesn't change. So I wish in general companies spent as much time on understanding that code, on understanding that core story, than on the specific platforms they used to tell it.
Yeah, fair point. I think do you get promoted for being a great storyteller? And I think the answer is yes, isn't it? That's the route. If you can't tell a good story about your own career and your own organization.
Well, and to this, I say yes to some extent. I think that I would say that you get hired if you're a great story builder. And what I mean by that is that you get promoted if you're a great story builder. What I mean by that is there are some great storytellers who never actually tell a once upon a time story. And, kind of the fundamental thesis behind my work is that the stories that we tell other people contain the same elements of the stories that we tell ourselves. And so if we understand those elements, then we can take any piece of information, put them in those categories. And if we share that information, people will build their own story in their minds about what we've told them. We don't have to say, once there was a man named Steve Jobs. We don't have to say, Sheryl Sandberg did X, Y, or Z. We can actually tell a bigger, broader story. Doesn't mean that those individual stories don't fit into it. What we're actually building is a narrative, a bigger story into which these smaller stories and these individuals stories, these hero stories can fit. And so I think that that's really the skill is, can you build a story to tell? Yes, of course. But can you build a story that people can tell themselves, so that ultimately they are kind of having that kind of consonance and that congruence that we're talking about, where those big ideas have transferred to them, where you're essentially uploading your information into the story processes of their brain, so that their brain goes, oh, I get it. Thanks for giving me this information in the format I was looking for. It's a lot more efficient. I don't have to ask you as many questions. And because you, the story builder, did the work, this is going to make immediately much more sense to me than something I have to start to kind of pick through and find the elements myself.
think it's a really interesting distinction between story building and storytelling, and it gets to the heart of what you've been talking about, I think, Tamsin.
Yeah.
We're out of time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us from throughout the world, and thank you very much, Tamsin Webster.
My pleasure.
Tamsin's book, Red Thread, is available now. Essential reading as an audio book version, spoken beautifully by Tamsin herself, which will be also available soon. And have you got another book in the pipeline, Tamsin?
I've just started on that thought, and you've heard some of the thinking about it today is actually really this split between psychological hero driven stories and sociological kind of society driven stories, and how we just don't have the tools to tell those societal stories as business storytellers, and yet they're actually the ones that we need to tell most often. So I'm just really curious on that line of thinking, and seeing what I might be able to do to help people understand when they need which kind of story and how to build both depending on what they need.
But first, people need to buy the Red Thread, and that will make sense and link to the next book, no doubt. Check out Tamsin's website, tamsinwebster.com. It's great starting blocks for Tamsin's ideas and thinking. Thank you very much for joining us. Next week, we will have Julie Carrier talking about leadership. Thank you, Tamsin, and thank you, everyone.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.